Hello friends, welcome to CEC Live Lectures. Dear friends, today in this session we are going to talk on party and party systems in India. Dear friends, we already had a session on the following topic where we discussed till 1898 and we discussed 1989 and we discussed the formation of the political party systems in India, and now today we are going to talk forward from 1989 and we are going to discuss on the party systems in India. And for the discussion on the topic, we have with us in our studios Dr. Satish Kumar Jha. Dr. Satish Kumar Jha is Associate Professor in Department of Political Science, Aryabhatta College, University of Delhi. Let's welcome our guest Dr. Satish Kumar Jha and let's try to understand more about party and party systems in India. Hello sir, welcome to the lecture.
Thank you, Geethika ji, and good afternoon. Today's lecture is the second part of the two parts series on party and party system in India. In fact, in my last lecture, what I had done that I had looked at that how parties have evolved in India. In fact, since colonial period. And how after independence, that in 1947, particularly after 1952, the first general election, how the party, and political parties have, conducted themselves, what are the issues involved in their functioning, and how scholars have looked at Indian party system. Is there any, systemic pattern or form through which one can understand political parties in India? Because a lot of scholars say that India doesn't have any party system, rather you have only configuration of parties, because there is no systemic form through which one could present Indian parties and their functioning. In fact, in that context, I also looked at some of the theories in comparative politics dealing with political parties, particularly Duverger and Sartori. Duverger in light of the kind of law which he basically proposes, particularly in terms of relationship between electoral system and political parties, whether that works out in India or not, particularly from the point of view of majoritarian first post the past system which India has, but that has not resulted into two-party system as per the argument of Duverger. Similarly, I also looked at Sartori's classification of political parties, particularly the multi-party system in terms of moderate pluralism, polarized pluralism, atomized pluralism, and then I mentioned that how India doesn't fit neatly into these three types of multi-party classifications made by Sartori. Of course, there are certain indicators which put India in category of moderate pluralism. There are certain indicators which put India in category of polarized pluralism. Of course, atomized pluralism does not seem to be applying to the Indian situation. So these issues we discussed. But apart from that, what I tried to discuss in my last lecture, that how in fact the evolution of political parties in India could be seen or could be presented in form of five or six different systemic patterns through which one could understand this entire role of political parties in Indian democracy. And those six forms or six systems, if one decides to use the term system, then the six different systems through which one could try to understand it. The first I mentioned was the movement party system. That was basically in context of colonial period when Indian National Congress was founded. It started as a movement party and gradually saw many twists and turns in its destiny, and after 1920s, particularly the mass movement phase during Gandhian era, how this entire party system or Indian National Congress took a definitive shape and continued till India attained independence. Then of course I discussed more extensively the post-independent situation or scenario, particularly after the first general election 1952, and in that context I discussed three eminent political scientists who have reflected on Indian party system. In fact, Maurice Jones and Rajni Kothari. In fact, La Palambara's predominant party system theory, I just mentioned that how Maurice Jones and Rajni Kothari seem to be guided by La Palambara's, or one can say that they also seem to be subscribing to that predominant party system model. But then of course Maurice Jones and Rajni Kothari have dealt with this issue in their own way. Maurice Jones as one party dominant system, and Rajni Kothari in particular through his Congress system, how tried to make very innovative formulations, and this is what I discussed in this second phase, that is 1952 to 69. 69 because that is the period when the ascendancy of the Congress, or one can say the one party dominant system, using Maurice Jones' phrase, in fact declined, and Congress's hegemony for the first time crumbled, and its monopoly on political power was also questioned. It started in 1967 with the defeat of Congress in the provincial elections. In many states, Congress lost power, but 69 is very important landmark in terms of the history of Congress as well as in terms of the working of Indian democracy, because Congress witnessed a split. One split, of course, Congress has witnessed during colonial period in 1907. But this 69 split, the post-independent split within the Congress, is quite significant because the split was on ideological lines to some extent. On the other hand, one can say that the syndicate indicate controversy within the Congress. But what is important from the point of view of party system in India, that this heralded a new era in Indian Indian politics, and that was basically the decline of Congress. And this is in fact, and it is around this time that scholars like Rajni Kothari started talking about the end of Congress system, which he had basically formulated in context of Nehruvian era of 52 to 60 60s, because Nehru died in 64. But Congress system, according to Kothari, continued till 69, 70, because his famous paper Congress System Revisited, which was published in Asian Survey, that appeared in 74. But nonetheless, one can say that the circumstances and situations on basis of which he had constructed this entire argument for the Congress system no longer existed after 69. So this is the second phase, and the third phase I had mentioned, that is the confrontationist phase of Indian party system, or one can say the confrontational system of parties in India, where one can see that Indira Gandhi's ascendancy as a supreme leader of the Congress after a split, and going for a snap poll in 71, winning a thumping majority, and then of course number of initiatives which she took, including the left populism, Garibi Hatao, and many other things, and therefore that is also the period which witnessed both her popularity as well as the decline in her popularity, because many mass movements also erupted around that time. Nav Nirman movement in Gujarat, JP movement initially in Bihar and then spread to different parts of India, anti-corruption campaign, and so on and so forth. So this is what I discussed as a confrontational phase in Indian politics, and therefore from the point of view of party system, one can say that was a confrontationist party system, that is the third page. And it lasted till 1980, because of course what happens that 75 emergencies promulgated, 77 emergencies lifted, and election is held, Congress loses power, Janata Party is formed, particularly after a merger of many political parties in opposition who were fighting against emergency and Mrs. Indira Gandhi, and that government, the Janata government, lasted till 1979, and finally 1980, when there was a general election, midterm poll, then what we find that Mrs. Gandhi comes back to power. So this is how this phase lasted from, one can say, 69 to 80. Then the fourth phase I was mentioning, and it is here that our discussion remained inconclusive last time. That was the phase from 1980. And this is normally called by many scholars as a phase in which a differentiation of parties or the party system started crystallizing at the central and at the regional level. At the central level, you had particular pattern. At the regional level, altogether a different pattern emerged, and therefore this differentiation is very significant. One could call it in fact a differentiation or differentiated party system from the point of view of national, regional patterns, because earlier we had the similar patterns more or less. Of course, there were regional parties. I will be taking up that issue later. Now, the fifth phase, of course, is this entire deepening of regionalized multi-party system with federal coalition and minority government phenomenon that starts in 1989. So, from 1980 to 89, you have this differentiation or the differentiated phase of Indian party system, national and state parties, or or one can say the working of parties at national and the regional level, state level, showing different patterns. But from 1989, altogether new phenomenon one witnesses in Indian politics, that is more regionalization, a pattern which emerged in 80s, particularly center-state relations, when many states had non-Congress government, in spite of the fact that Mrs. Gandhi came back to power in 1980. But nonetheless, Congress lost power in many state elections, including Andhra, in Karnataka, in Jammu and Kashmir, in Assam, and so on and so forth. And many new regional parties emerged, because regional parties are basically old in Indian politics. They have a very old existence, because Dravidian parties like DMK, AIDMK, National Conference, and many Akali Dal, these are the parties which have had their origin at the time of independence, and some of them even predate independence. But what happened at 80s, you have the birth of new regional parties with new set of issues emerging, and therefore this entire regionalization of Indian politics, which is basically an issue which draws a lot of attention of political scientists today, started around this time. So therefore, what we find that this phase, which started in 1980s, by 89 started showing signs of its maturity, and therefore what happened that in this phase it got deepened. 1989, Rajiv Gandhi lost power, basically after 1984 election, when he had he had won a massive mandate, particularly after assassination of Mrs. Indira Gandhi. But in 1989 general election, Congress lost power. But interestingly, this is also an election in which a hung parliament emerged. No political party was in a position to form the government, and in a hung situation, what happened? A minority government led by VP Singh was formed, supported by two ideological extremes of Indian politics, left and right, supported on the one hand by the CPM, CPI, one can say the left front, and on other hand supported by the BJP, the right leaning political party in Indian politics. So this was a new phase, and this phase continued for many years. The phenomenon of minority government, phenomenon of coalition politics, and this didn't end with 91 election, because after 2 years this National Front government fell. Of course, after 1 year it fell. Then it was a Chandrasekhar led government supported by Congress from outside, that also fell. Then you had election in 1991, again a minority government led by Congress leader Narasimha Rao, supported not by any political party, but political parties allowed it to form a minority government, and that continued till 1996. 96 again Congress loses power and replaced by a united front, and that is basically the period when you had Janata Dal led united front supported by many regional parties and the left parties, and Deve Gowda and Gujral becoming prime minister, followed by 98 election when Atal Bihari Vajpayee, leader of BJP, coming to power as an NDA leader or an NDA prime minister. National Democratic Alliance is formed on basis of common minimum program, and that government lasted 2004. Of course, after 1 year there was another election in 1999 when the BJP improved its tally, but nonetheless it was an NDA government, continued till 2004, and 2004 election again there was a coalition government. It was the Congress led UPA, and this was UPA 1, 2004 to 9. Then the next election was 2009, and that was the UPA 2. That is again a coalition, again of course the Congress with the improved situation in Lok Sabha, but nonetheless it was a coalition government. So UPA 2, and it continued till 2014. So what I want to say here, that this entire pattern, or one can say the phenomenon which started in 1989 continued till 2014, when no single party could get the majority seats in the parliament, and therefore it was always a coalition minority government at the center. And this pattern is something very significant from the point of view of Indian politics, because there are many scholars who believe that there are many implications of this this event, or one can say this this new phenomenon in Indian politics. One important implication of this was that Indian polity got federalized. And interestingly, the experts on Indian federalism, they say that because the Indian constitution is federal in nature, of course it has a lot of unitary tendencies in spite of being a federal polity. Constitution is loaded in favor of of the center in terms of its rights and its prerogatives. But what happened after 89, that in spite of a constitution of India showing signs of unitary tendencies, but the entire polity got federalized due to the transformation of party system. And how this happened has been a matter of debate and concern for many political scientists, that how this happened, that in spite of the no major change being witnessed in this period in the constitutional design, how India got federalized through the agency of, or through the instrumentality of party system. Because what happened, the regional parties started playing more important role in Indian politics after 1989, from the formation of government at the center to the policy formulation to the selection of the prime minister in coalition government, particularly in 89, 96. One can say that when of course the Congress and BJP were not leading the government, the choice of the prime minister in fact was exercised by the regional parties when Dev Gowda, Gujral, VP Singh became the prime minister. So therefore this federalization of polity as a result of transformation of Indian party system from the predominant, or one can say one party dominant system, it moved in direction of multi-party system, and that continued till 2014. And the 2014 is important because this is the sixth phase, because the sixth phase what we find that it is still continuing. Why it is significant? Because for the first time after 1989, that one political party could get majority of seats at its own, or was in a position to form the government. That was BJP under our new leader Narendra Modi. And therefore what happened, that though they formed an NDA government, National Democratic Alliance government, but BJP as a major party with clear-cut majority in the parliament, and therefore it was for the first time after 89 that this entire hung parliament, coalition government and minority government, this phenomenon ended. And therefore that also heralded a new era in Indian politics from the point of view of the party system, as well as from the point of view of one political party, that is BJP, which is basically which emerged from the erstwhile Bharatiya Janasangh of the earlier era. So therefore what happened, that 2014 signals a new development. Whether this entire thing is going to be long lasting or is temporary is too early to say. In fact, jury is out on this, because only after 2019 general election, or one can say that not 19, after 1 or 2 or 3 general elections, one could be in a position to give a definitive observation or a statement on this thing, that what direction Indian party system has taken. Because 89 to 2014 it was a long spell in which we could see a particular pattern, the regionalization of polity through the predominance of regional parties. But 2014 onwards, if we are finding a new pattern emerging in Indian party system, whether it is going to last or it is going to be a temporary one, that is basically too early for us to pass any judgment at this moment. Only after 19, or one can say that 2-3 general elections, one would be in a position to give any conclusive observation or remark on this. So this is how we have to look at the 5 different or 6 different phases of party system in India. The 3 phases we had discussed in detail in our last lecture. But the 4th phase, that differentiated phase of Indian party system, that is post 1980, in fact we couldn't discuss, and therefore I will touch on that, and then I will move ahead, particularly the 5th and 6th, and then some of the issues or the debates on Indian party system we also have to discuss today. Now the 4th phase, that is the 1980, Indira Gandhi comes back to power. Of course, one thing is interesting, which I basically alluded in my last lecture also, that there was no rebuilding of the pluralist federal Congress structure, which was basically which was existing during the Nehru's era, what is normally remembered as Nehruvian phase in Indian politics, a phase for which Rajni Kothari gave that Congress system. In fact, what was significant in this period, that there was no internal elections within the Congress. One can say that this entire inner party democracy gradually disappeared. And of course, in 1992 when Narasimha Rao was the Prime Minister, they conducted election for electing their working committee and other members, but nonetheless it was not as well institutionalized, or one can say that it was not well organized the way perhaps it used to happen earlier. So I mean, this rebuilding of this pluralist federal Congress party could not happen during this phase, because what happens that after 1971 or 69, a split of Congress, it became a party associated or basically identified with the personality of Mrs. Indira Gandhi. And what happened in this phase, that because of her charismatic personality and because of his populist rhetoric, the left-wing populist rhetoric, because populism can have both faces, the left-wing populism and right-wing populism. But Mrs. Gandhi took to left-wing populism, Garibi Hatao, poverty eradication, and many other things. What happened, that she started mobilizing people or started addressing the electorates over the shoulder of the party. In fact, it was not through the party that she was basically establishing contacts and connect with the people, but directly the leader was addressing the constituents. So what happened, that the organization, Congress as an organization, took a beating in this period. And what happened, interestingly, that when Indira Gandhi lost power, Janata Party came under Morarji Desai with lot of tall claims, but so far as the restoration of this democratic functioning of party is concerned, one can say that it could not restore it the way perhaps people had expected. So therefore what happened, that one important implication from the point of view of the political parties is in this period is basically a tendency towards centralization. And another important tendency was this personality cult in Indian politics, where many scholars in fact call also the beginning of dynasty-based politics in India. And because Indira Gandhi was succeeded by Rajiv Gandhi in 1985. 84-85. So therefore, these two tendencies, this centralization, personality-based political parties, and then tendency of nurturing and cultivating dynasties, this entire tendency started in this period. I also mentioned that this is the period when also we find that lot of protest, or one can say that lot of churning started around center-state relations. And it is in this context that we should remember that 1983, that the government instituted a commission under Sarkaria, Justice Sarkaria, to study center-state relations, and Sarkaria Commission came with its recommendations in 1988. But what basically before Sarkaria Commission was instituted, in fact it was preceded by a series of conclaves among regional parties, and the most important was of the Vijayawada conclave of 1983, when N.T. Ramarao won Andhra Pradesh election. Ramakrishna Hegde of Janata Party, of course it was a national party at that time, but nonetheless it won Karnataka as on a regional plank. National Conference, an old regional party in Kashmir, Jammu and Kashmir, won election, and after Sheikh Abdullah, it was Farooq Abdullah who became the chief minister. All Assam Gan Parishad in Assam under Prafulla Mahanta became a ruling party, and therefore many regional parties came into power in various regions, various states, and they started questioning the dominance of centre on the states. Particularly, they took up this issue of fiscal federalism, the financial devolution from the centre to states. They wanted revisiting this entire centre-state relations in light of certain deformities which in their opinion had crept into the constitutional design as well as democratic practice. So this is the period of regional parties coming into power, mobilizing the people on regional issues, and finally we find that 1984-85 Mrs. Gandhi is assassinated and succeeded by Rajiv Gandhi, but that period does not make major changes from the point of view of the functioning of the parties. Of course, Rajiv Gandhi's presidential address in the Congress session in Bombay was something very significant when he talked about corruption, when he talked about inner party democracy, when he talked about many other issues. But immediately we find that all these tall claims and lofty ideas could not be translated into action. Of course, inner party factionalism also surfaced. The charges of corruption, particularly the Bofors issue, came up. VP Singh, a very important member of the cabinet, rebelled and formed his own outfit, the Jan Morcha, and that basically gradually culminated into 1989, the formation of Janata Dal and coming into power of a minority government headed by VP Singh and the Janata Dal. But what is important here, as I was mentioning, that 1989, when we find a new pattern emerges, the kind of pattern which we saw emerging in 1980s, the regionalization of polity. By 89, it became quite mature, and therefore what happened, that this federal coalitions and minority government phenomenon started in India. That is the coalition politics, era of coalition politics. It is to be remembered that Congress from the very beginning was not very comfortable with this idea of coalition politics, because Congress was replaced from power through coalition politics. But on the other hand, the left parties were successfully practicing this coalition politics in Bengal and Kerala. Even BJP was gradually, he came around this view that coalition politics could be the only, way the Indian democratic process could be conducted in future. So therefore, they also formed this National Democratic Alliance in 1996, and particularly after 98 when they came to power. So this is how the 89 period is important. But what I'm also, what I would also like to mention here, that what happened that in this era, there are few other important developments from the point of view of party system. On the one hand, you have the ascendancy of regional parties and the decline of national parties like Congress. One can say the decline of one party dominant system. On the other hand, you have the broad power sharing among various regional parties and various interest groups, social interest groups, or one can say identity groups. So what happened that earlier regional parties were formed on basis of regional identities, but in this period we find that some parties started getting formed on basis of new identities, social identities like caste, ethnicity, and so on and so forth. So therefore what happened, a different pattern of power sharing started in India, and this power sharing is a very important theme for democracy. In fact, of course, as all of us are aware, the famous political scientist Leffert and his entire contribution on consociationalism, and even in India, this Congress system, which was basically given by Kothari, was based on this idea of power sharing. But what happened here, we find a different type of power sharing in coalition era, power sharing among various identity groups through their political outfits, that is political parties. So therefore, this was another significant development. But at the same time, we should also remember that this is the period when we find a phenomenal growth of Bharatiya Janata Party, a party which was formed in 1980, particularly of course owing its origin to the Bharatiya Janasangh of the earlier era. But in 1980, after the Janata government fell and of course different parties parted company, the erstwhile Janasangh got reborn as a new party, and it was called Bharatiya Janata Party. So this period 1989 onwards, we find a phenomenal growth of Bharatiya Janata Party, particularly around the issues of certain issues which it raised, and therefore what happened that this period became significant for the expansion of the social base of BJP. So this is something significant. But there are other issues that continued till 2014, and 2014, as I was mentioning, that signals a new transformation of Indian party system. So this is what we have to discuss, along with certain other issues that basically confront Indian party system today.
With this note, thank you so very much for giving us this session. Friends, we will be back after a short break, and we'll be discussing more. Till then, keep watching us. Thank you. Hello friends, welcome back to this session. Friends, as you know that today we are talking on party and party systems in India, and we are talking the time period from 1989 onwards. And for the discussion on the topic, we have with us in our studios Dr. Satish Kumar Jha. Dr. Satish Kumar Jha is Associate Professor in the Department of Political Science, Aryabhatta College, University of Delhi. So let's welcome our guest, Dr. Satish Kumar Jha, once again. Hello sir, welcome to the lecture.
Thank you. In fact, in the earlier session, we are discussing about the fifth phase of the evolution of party system in India, particularly from 1989. That is the era in which I mentioned that regionalization of polity happened, and how in fact it also resulted into more federalization of Indian polity through the ascendancy of regional parties. Earlier, as I mentioned, that Indian polity was loaded in favor of center particularly the monopoly of power the national parties exercise, that got eroded, and now regional parties started playing important role. But at the same time, I was also mentioning that 1989 period also signals a new development in Indian politics from the point of view of party system. That is basically birth of identity based political parties, or one can say that this identity politics in India took a new shape. Of course, identity politics was not new. In fact, this started way back in the colonial period when separate electorates, issue of weightage, veto, reservation and other issues were being debated and contested. But in post-independent period, what happened, that a new phenomenon started basically related to representation, and the parties claim to be an agency to represent multiple interests in society, or one can say the party an agency for interest aggregation and not simply interest articulation. But what happens here in 89, that party's entire functioning as in terms of interest aggregation seems to have basically collapsed, or one can say that took a new turn. If not collapsed, then took a new turn. And here we find that every interest group in society, or one can say every identity group in society started aspiring for its own agency to articulate and represent its interests. So therefore, the birth of many political parties based on certain social identities, be it caste, ethnicity or religion. So therefore, what happened, that ascendancy of this identity based political parties, and it is in this context I was mentioning the phenomenal growth of Bharatiya Janata Party after 1989, which itself took up many issues which fit into this characterization of identity politics. In fact, it took up the issue of this Ram Janmabhoomi Ayodhya movement. It took up the issue of universal uniform civil code 370 and many other issues which were there since the days of Bharatiya Janasangh. But Bharatiya Janata Party in new form, that is after its birth in 1980, of course embraced new issues also. It talked about socialism of a different type, but nonetheless these issues continued. But 1989 onwards, we find the phenomenal growth of BJP in terms of expansion of its social base. Earlier it was called that it was only centered in certain areas and it was only centered in certain social groups. But now it appeared that its entire appeal was getting expanded, and it was across caste, class and community lines, particularly caste and class line, not in terms of religious community. So therefore, what happened, that on the one hand BJP as representative of this new brand of politics, on the other hand that many other regional parties emerged, and they are called Mandal based parties, because Mandal Commission which came in 1990 about the OBC reservation, that created a situation when the issue of reservation, OBC reservation, became very prominent in North Indian states, and some of the parties which took up this issue became very popular in certain constituencies in society, and therefore their popularity, their social base also got strengthened. So this was a new development in Indian politics. In fact, commenting on BJP, one scholar, Oliver Heath, he basically talks of the three areas so far as the expansion of BJP's social base is concerned. He said that there is a primary area, there is secondary area and there is a tertiary area. He said that primary area is where the erstwhile Bharatiya Janasangh was powerful in 50s and 60s. There are Rajasthan, Gujarat, Madhya Pradesh, Delhi, UP and Himachal. Then there is secondary area where basically they became important around 1989. They are Karnataka, Bihar, Goa, Maharashtra, Andhra Pradesh, Orissa, Assam, Punjab and Haryana. And then there is a tertiary area where they became important after 1989. They are Kerala, Tamil Nadu, West Bengal and northeastern states. And now, in fact, what we find that after 2014, the kind of victory they have basically registered in many North Indian and northeastern states, that basically tells us that in the tertiary sector, that is the third sector according to Oliver Heath, in fact, one can say that how they have basically deepened their hold, or one can say they have strengthened their social base. So therefore, what happened that this is a new development in Indian politics from the point of view of the party system. Now, one thing we should remember that earlier, Paul Brass, a very seasoned and eminent observer on Indian politics, talked about, while talking about party system in India, made a distinction between parties in wheat growing areas and rice growing areas. Now, in fact, one can also attempt to relate this, parties, particularly a party like BJP, with certain, land settlement area which was made during the colonial period. Because as it is well known that during colonial period, three important land settlements were made, Jamindari, Rayatwari and Mahalwari. And one can say that only Mahalwari area of land settlement during colonial period was based on old community linkages. Otherwise, in Rayatwari and Mahalwari, in Rayatwari and Jamindari, what happened? The land settlement was done on basis of individual, entitlement. And therefore, there are many historians who have worked on rule of private property in India, and they argue that there was no concept of private property in India earlier, but it came only through these land settlements, when land got tied with individual entitlements. But Mahalwari area, in fact, this earlier pattern of the community affiliation, remained intact. And one can find that the BJP's or Bharatiya Jansangh's initial, ascendancy, or one can say the initial foothold, was in the Mahalwari region, a region which was essentially anchored in this community identity. And since the days of Bharatiya Jansangh, in fact, this entire attempt to talk about this community identity of individual, glorifying Indian culture, or relating politics with the earlier, or one can say the ancient Indian social practices. These things have been the part and parcel of both Bharatiya Jansangh and BJP. Therefore, one can say that this relationship becomes interesting, that how in Mahalwari area, the Bharatiya Jansangh got the first foothold, and even today it retains in those Mahalwari area. Of course, there is temporary setback in Delhi when it lost power in 2-3 consecutive elections, but nonetheless one can say that its foothold is still quite strong in these areas. So this is something I thought that could be interesting from the point of view of relating the land settlement in India and in modern period, and the emergence of political parties and their existence. Now, what happened in 2004, I was mentioning that ascendancy of BJP led to the formation of National Democratic Alliance in 1998 under Vajpayee, and this was the first time that they built a coalition of many regional parties, and that also marked the end of its isolation in Indian politics, when many political parties who earlier were not in a position or in a mood to do any business with either earlier Jansangh or later BJP started coalition with it and built coalition under the leadership of BJP, and that continued to 2004. 2004, of course, it lost the election and a new coalition came back to power, that is United Progressive Alliance, UPA 1, under Manmohan Singh. And of course, what happened that it was a left of the center coalition, because it was a coalition in which the left political parties, who for the first time won more than 60 seats in parliament, supported the government from outside. And not only that, there was a steering committee dealing with important issues. There was a common minimum program on basis of which the left extended support. So therefore, this is a very interesting development, because we should remember that in 1991 we have had the economic reforms in India, and then it also led to some extent a bipartisan consensus between the two important national parties, the Congress and BJP, on economic reforms. The governments changed, but their commitment for economic reforms continued, of course with some modifications, policy modifications. But this left of the center coalition in 2004 heralded a new period, particularly in era of economic reforms, in spite of Manmohan Singh, the architect of India's economic reforms, becoming the Prime Minister under new coalition. But at the same time, as I was mentioning, the common minimum program, basically in which the left had committed itself, in fact wanted these economic reforms to be tampered with certain social concerns and economic concerns of the disprivileged sections of society. It is in this context a new concept also emerged, National Advisory Council, and for the first time the social movements in India got a direct say in the policy formulations of the government, because National Advisory Council, led by the Congress President Sonia Gandhi, had many members from the different social movements, different organizations which were spearheading social movements in India, like Aruna Roy and many others. So therefore, it was altogether different phase in Indian politics when left of the center coalition was built, and it is we should remember that in this period, largely on account of this social movements coming into a play so far as policy formulation is concerned, and left of the center tilt of the government under pressure of the left parties, we find that many legislations were also enacted, like Manrega, which was earlier this National Rural Employment Guarantee Scheme, for certain enactments for the forest dwellers, Right to Information Act. Of course, Right to Information Act got initiated earlier, but basically it was enacted around this time. So therefore, many legislations came into existence around, many acts, parliamentary acts were enacted. So this is how we find that this phase continued till 2014, the UPA 1 and UPA 2. Of course, in this period we also find the birth of a new political party, that is Aam Aadmi Party. Basically as a result of this anti-corruption movement led by Anna Hazare after 2011, and therefore it was a new phenomenon which talked about beyond identity and beyond ideology, politics, because they talked about end of ideology and end of identity, because Indian politics doesn't need either ideology and identity, it only needs articulation of interest of the people. So this is another important development in this period. Now 2014 I was mentioning, this is the phase which is continuing after 2014 election. What started in 89 ended in 14. For the first time, one party could win the majority of seats in parliament, that is BJP under the leadership of Narendra Modi, and he became the Prime Minister. What happened, that this phenomenon of coalition government and minority government also ended. At the same time, one can also find that BJP later on registered its victory in many state elections, like UP, in fact in Gujarat, in fact in Maharashtra, and many northeastern states. So therefore, there was expansion of the BJP's hold on the electorates in different parts of the country. Now what happened, that whether, as I mentioned, that this emergence of again one party dominant system, because right now BJP appears to be in a dominant position. In fact, earlier it was, as I mentioned in my first lecture, earlier it was the anti-Congressism which was the glue of opposition parties. Now it is becoming anti-BJPism as the glue for non-opposition parties, because opposition parties come together on issue of fighting the BJP. So this dominance of BJP, or one can say the predominance, does it show the re-emergence of one party dominant system, or what Kothari talked of Congress system, of course in a different context, because Congress system was premised on certain other factors, but one party dominant system characterization one can use here. Is it reenactment of that, or is it a temporary phenomenon? And again it will go in the same direction in which we find India from 89 to 2014. Now as I mentioned, jury is out on this. It is too early to give any conclusive observation. Only after 2-3 elections we will be in a position to give any conclusive remark or conclusive observation that what direction Indian politics has taken. But one thing is very clear, that 2014 election also signaled one important development, that the identity-based regional parties which had emerged in 89, in fact, they appeared to have declined because many of them lost their vote share in the elections. It appeared that the era of identity politics is over, and that coincided with the birth of Aam Aadmi Party, which talked about politics beyond identity. But again we find that in last few months they have again regained their hold on their constituency, and therefore it is also not possible to conclusively say anything that whether identity politics has declined or identity politics suffered only a temporary setback in 2014 election. So this is how we can see that this entire Indian party system has evolved over 6 phases and in last 7 decades and so. Now another way to look at Indian parties could be through the party families, and this is also important. When I say party families, not the families of leaders, but families of ideologies. And here one can say that there are 3-4 important families, party families. You have a Congress family, and Congress family implies that there are many parties which have come out of Congress and they have become a separate outfit. And many of them share many things with the Congress, but nonetheless they have separate existence. And here one can say that party earlier also we had the Bangla Congress, we had Kerala Congress, Loktantrik Congress, in fact Congress for Democracy, Congress Ars, Congress Swaran Singh, Nationalist Congress Party NCP, Jan Morcha, in fact Tiwari Congress, Tamil Manila Congress, TMC in Bengal, and so on and so forth. So they are basically part of the Congress family, and they have from time to time they have gone out of this coalition, building coalition with Congress. At times they have come together, but nonetheless they owe their origin to Congress. They have a lot of commonalities, ideological moorings which they share with the Congress. Then there is a second family that is called Sangh Parivar family, that applies to the Rashtriya Sangh Sevak Sangh, RSS, the parent organization of Bharatiya Jan Sangh and BJP, though it is a cultural organization, but nonetheless plays important role so far as the working and functioning of BJP and earlier Jan Sangh was concerned. So what happened in this family, we have many outfits like RSS, VHP, Bajrang Dal, Shiv Sena. Of course Shiv Sena sometimes claims a separate identity also, but nonetheless one can put it in this family, the Sangh family. And then the third is the Janta family, and in Janta family you have earlier the Janta Party, then after split of Janta Party we had many parties which have come into existence. Today one can say that you have RJD, you have Samajwadi Party, you have BJD, you have Janata Dal Secular in Karnataka, and so on and so forth. So these are the Janta Party, one can say, basically a party which is essentially now a regional party, because Janata Party had a national presence, but after a split these parties are more or less regional parties. Then you have Dalit families, Dalit parties, or one can say the parties which claim to represent the interests and concerns of the Dalits in India. They also have a family because there are many parties, and they are also regional parties to some extent. Of course the BSP's vote share once made it a national party. So in fact you have the Republican Party, you have Dalit Panthers. Of course Dalit Panthers does not participate in electoral politics. You have BSP, in fact, and so on and so forth. So therefore this is then you have the left wing family, the left left parties. They also part of a larger family. If the the Dalit parties owe their origin to the ideas and ideologies of Phule, Ambedkar, Periyar, the left parties owe their origin to Marxist-Leninist ideology, and therefore you have CPM, CPI, CPI-ML, Forward Bloc, and so on and so forth. So therefore, in fact, we have many parties under this category also. So this is another way to look at the party system in India in terms of the families, ideological families. of parties in India. Then one could also make a distinction between regional parties and the national parties. In my last lecture I mentioned that how Election Commission has a mechanism to characterize or to recognize a party as a national party and a regional party on basis of the percentage of votes and seats, 6% votes and then number of seats, etc., which I mentioned last time. Now the regional parties in fact have three areas or pockets of presence, one can say, in India. You have a deep south, then you have northeast, and you have the northwest. And one can say that what happened, that these three areas of the presence of regional parties, one can say that they can be looked at from three different point of view. Moderate, the first is this second is one is intermediate regionalism, then is the moderate regionalism, and then the first one is of course a pronounced regionalism. Now the first pronounced regionalism one can say is in deep south, northeast and northwest. Then you have the intermediate regionalism, that is the regional parties in this zone is Bengal, Andhra Pradesh, Maharashtra and Assam. And then you have the moderate regionalism. And in moderate regionalism, one can say that parties are more nationalistic than regional, whereas in the earlier to the intermediate regionalism and the pronounced regionalism, the parties are more regional than nationalistic. In moderate regionalism phase, one can say that you have basically the Hindi speaking belt of Gujarat, Odisha, Maharashtra and Karnataka. Of course, one should also remember here that the many political parties, the oldest regional party in India, they come from the Jammu Kashmir, Punjab and northeast, that is the northwest region of India. Of course, in recent years we have seen that the new political parties have become very strident in Andhra Pradesh, Telangana and many other states. So this is how one can have some idea of parties through this regional prism. Then of course is the issue of the ideological spectrum of political parties, that how on our ideological scale one could understand or study Indian political parties. Now one thing we should remember, because I had mentioned Sartari in my earlier lecture and also today, that Sartari's classification of party is based on two considerations, ideology and number, and particularly in multi-party system. In fact, this ideological consideration, if we bring into the discussion in India, we find that there is a cynical view that ideology does not matter for political parties in India, because one can say that all political parties often try to bend their ideology for pragmatic politics, but nonetheless we can see some ideological patterns among political parties, and some of the ideologies around which the political parties basically are wedded could be presented in terms of binaries like nationalism versus regionalism, statism versus market, secularism versus communalism, caste versus class, and this is how one could say that parties get divided among themselves. Then of course there is another way to make a distinction among or characterize political parties: centrist, leftist, rightist. This is a very important characterization in India. This Nehruvian period was known for the dominance of the centrist politics. Then of course the leftist space is normally associated with the politics of left parties, and the rightist space is normally associated with parties which talked about free market, cultural nationalism and so on and so forth. Earlier it was Swatantra Party, Bharatiya Janasangh, today is Bharatiya Janata Party, Shiv Sena, Akali Dal and so on and so forth. But what has happened, that after economic reforms and the kind of bipartisan consensus we find on economic reforms, this ideological distinction in some terms of centrist, leftist and rightist are getting completely effaced, because most of the parties have a broader more or less a consensus on economic reforms. So this is how we have to see the ideological spectrum of political parties. But then there are other issues particularly in terms of the issues confronting Indian political parties, and they are very important issues from the point of view of future of Indian democracy. They have to be debated, particularly from the point of view of inner party democracy, the funding of political parties, the criminalization of political parties, politics of defection, and number of reforms related proposals which have been mooted by Election Commission and many organizations. So in fact, we will be taking up these issues in our next lecture.
With this one, thank you, sir. Thank you so very much for giving us this session on party and party systems in India. Friends, there is a lot more for you. We will be meeting again soon in our next session, that is next lecture. Till then, take care. Goodbye. Thank you, sir. Thank you so very much.